Hello, this session is focusing on total cost of ownership, a really important procurement and supply chain concept. What we're concerned with TCO, total cost of ownership, is thinking about and evaluating the total product life cycle. So life cycle cost analysis or total cost analysis is defined here. It's a compilation and evaluation of all of the inputs, outputs, and increasingly potential environmental impacts of a product system throughout its life cycle. So we're not just concerned with how much did it cost to purchase it, what are the costs throughout the whole of that product life cycle? And this is a classic map of a product life cycle, and we use this in sustainable management. We use it when we're trying to understand total environmental impact, etc. And it looks very much like a classic supply chain, doesn't it? You know, we start with our raw material acquisition. How do we extract that from the earth? How do we process that material? How is that material then manufactured and components assembled? What about the use? How long do we use it for? How do we service it? And at the end of life, how do we retire and maybe even recover products? And for those things that we can't recover, how do we treat that disposal? And at each stage in that life cycle, we've got materials and energy inputs to the processes and to distribution. And we've got waste, such as gas, liquid or solid, coming out of the product. So in a nutshell, this is what a product life cycle looks like. Life cycle analyses are used certainly in the design process to try and identify environmental footprint. They're used after the fact to identify which are environmentally preferred products. So once you've got a range of design options, carrying out a life cycle analysis is increasingly being used to look at the total environmental impact. And as we'll see in the sustainable supply chain class, this is an important tool, an important concept. But in a nutshell, for total cost of ownership at this stage in our understanding, we're going to focus on the life cycle of the product and how that determines its economic impact as well as environmental. And often there are many uncertainties, even if the life cycle is mapped out. And life cycle analysis, to be frank, is generally a compromise between what's practical and how complete can it be. And as we will have probably seen in the video interview with Lisa Elram, total cost of ownership is a philosophy for really understanding all supply chain related costs of doing business with a particular supplier for a particular good or service. A great example of this is one that I've heard so many times over the years. The example of somebody saying, well, look, I don't know how much these shoes have cost me because I'm still wearing them. I bought them 8 years ago. I paid, $150 for them. I polished them. I've had them repaired twice. They're still serviceable. I won't know until the end of life what the total cost of ownership of those shoes was, nor the benefits or values. The challenge we have in procurement, of course, is we've got to do this from the outset. We've got to estimate total cost of ownership when we're taking sourcing decisions. And really what we're trying to do is to focus on procuring materials, services, equipment, where we focus not on the price, but on total cost. I cannot emphasize enough how critical this is for us in procurement. And one reason it's critical is we hear this all the time from users. Oh, I can buy this cheaper online. I've just found a cheaper airline ticket than the one through our corporate travel. Or again, we often get this in procurement. A user will say, I found a supplier, just give them an order. Just place the order with a supplier. It's exactly what we need. One of the common complaints I remember from my first job straight out of university when I was a procurement manager. I was constantly getting berated by the guys on the shop floor. Procurement just slows things down. What they really meant was they'd forgotten to even think about resourcing, and at the last minute they were constantly panicking. And then I hear this all the time when I'm doing consulting work and also in my role at USD. Oh, I've got a great deal. I'll save the company over 10% on the list price. And sometimes you have to point out, well, you do know that we actually have a 30% rebate already agreed off the list price. So you going behind the contract outside of procurement, you've actually cost us money. And there's a world of difference between shopping and strategic procurement. We're focusing on price at the moment, and when we think about how marketing people will talk about price, they'll talk about price as being determined in two distinct ways. One is cost-based pricing. In other words, we look at how much were the ingredients, how long does it take us, what's the overhead. That's the price we're going to charge. We add our margin on, and that determines the price. Marketing professionals will also say, really our job is to look at values-based pricing. What's the economic value to customer? What are the customer's needs? What's their value propositioning? Let's set a target price to match that perceived value. Then look at what costs can we incur to give us a product that delivers value at a target price and thus a margin. And so in my time in the auto industry, that was where we started. We didn't have a design for the vehicle, but we knew how much we were going to sell it for and how much profit. So we had a target price. Those are very different issues. And when you're doing your total supply analysis, you can start with, well, how much is a customer going to pay for it? Let's work backwards. But what I really want you to do in the TSA is go the other way. What should the price be? What are the actual costs? And in TCO, there are three key components: acquisition, ownership, and post-ownership. And we're going to be looking very briefly, and in your textbook you'll see this as well. We're going to look very briefly at total cost of ownership, net present value analysis, and estimated costs. Because that's what's going to drive supply management to act. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. This is just an introduction to TCO. We're going to pick it up a lot later. But an important equation, or an important concept, I suppose, is to understand what value means. And value is the ratio of function to the cost. And let me give an example of this from my personal experience. So when I look at the value of a guitar I've owned for nearly 30 years now, it was expensive when we bought it, and I won't tell you how much it was. But for me, given that I've got short fingers, I'm not very good at bar chords, I like playing acoustic, I play chords and a little bit of lead, it really had a good neck that I could play. It also had a sound that appealed to my ears. It had a good full range. It wasn't too trebly. And so when we talk about function, we're talking about attributes, benefits to the consumer. So think about what value is. It's the ratio of the benefits or the function that we get out to the cost that we're paying. That's why some of us will pay, we'll pay $700 for a pair of Golden Goose sneakers, and the rest of us may pay $80 at Costco for a pair of sneakers. It's what's the function, what are the benefits? When we're dealing with service providers, and apologies for this being a bit of a busy chart, but service providers are quite distinctive. We really need to understand overheads when we're looking at service businesses, because it's the overheads that are a dominant cost sector. And of course, revenue has to cover overheads, direct costs, material and labor. Otherwise, we can't generate a profit. So when I ran my floristry business, I really spent a lot of time working with my accountant to try and identify what my overheads really were. And it was a very messy problem. Um, we also have to consider the recurring material costs that are often overlooked. We have to think about analysis of the labor base. So maybe we can reap a lower cost per person or greater benefits or improve morale. And with equipment purchases, it's often very helpful to reduce maintenance and parts over the life of investments. And that last bullet point mirrors what's happening in the service sector. A lot of businesses are now doing full service supply. In other words, you don't necessarily buy a piece of equipment, you buy X years of use. You know, if it's an air conditioning unit, rather than buying the air conditioning unit and then having to deal with repair and maintenance separately, what we do is we source with an air conditioning provider and say, look, here's the building, it's 800,000 square feet. We want to have this environmental condition inside the building, and we want you to give us a price for the next 6 years. We're not going to buy the product from you. In essence, we're leasing it, but we want a full service supply. That's increasingly what we're seeing in the service sector. In manufacturing, probably it's very straightforward in comparison to service. We have got the same total cost of ownership issues, but we're very much concerned with direct materials. We're also focusing on manufacturing overhead, and we're also interested in the variance between should cost and actual cost. And this is what your total supply analysis is doing. It's looking at the should cost versus the actual cost. As we'll discover later on in the program, ABC, or activity-based costing, is one way in which we can address this issue of overheads. Because as I've said, it's a challenge in manufacturing. It's also a challenge in service. It's a major problem in our TCO analysis to accurately allocate overhead. And so using activity-based costing can help improve cost allocation. It's a technique for accumulating cost for a given cost object, like a machine tool, that represents the total and true economic resources required or consumed by the object. Bit of a mouthful. Think of the overheads of owning a car. You know, what is the cost of the garage that you park it in? What's the cost of depreciation of the car just sitting outside your house or sitting in the parking lot? Those are some examples of how we use activity-based costing to understand overhead. So let's dig in for a few slides now to think about total cost of ownership. We've clearly got to build a model that takes into account all of our costs of acquisition, buying, our ownership cost, and our post-ownership costs. And these slides obviously I'll make available in addition to this video. But acquisition costs include your purchase price. They include the planning costs. Planning costs can include going out to bid. It can include all of the decision time that we take trying to determine what is the right product. Costs of quality. Is it a reliable product? Is it unreliable? Taxes, any interest that we pay. Ownership costs, again, I think about this with my car. What downtime do I have? How often is it in service? How often does it break down? What are the risks with the vehicle? What about cycle time costs? How quickly, for example, can we produce a product on a machine tool? What about if we have to convert it to adapt it for different uses? And then there's a whole bunch of non-value added costs if we do some process analysis, and then supply chain costs like transport and logistics. So when we're looking at ownership, and again this applies to so many resources, we have to think about every activity and try and ascribe a cost to it. And then Post-ownership clearly is around environmental costs, any costs of warranty, product liability, and how happy is the customer, because dissatisfied customers cost us money. I'll go very briefly through each of those three sections. So increasingly, we're mindful of duties and tariffs, regional trade agreements, and then shifting bases, income bases for how we calculate financing costs. With ownership costs, a lot of concern will be if we buy a piece of capital equipment. You may hear in the background some stone cutting. I'm having a wall built and a drive laid. The guys who are doing the contracting have got some earth moving equipment. They've been on the job for 10 days, and that earth moving equipment has been sitting here for 10 days. And then on average, they've worked 5 hours a day for 4 days. So for 20 hours in 10 days, so 20 out of 240 hours, it's been productive. So that's 220 hours of downtime. There's risks, you know. We have some crazy drivers on our street at times. Could they collide with the diggers? What about cycle time costs? How long does it take us when we're using a product to actually get output? What productivity? Any conversions if we have to update it to meet different regulatory requirements or power requirements? And what are the non-value added costs? There's a whole raft of supply chain costs. And again, I'm not going to read these to you because they're a bit more self-evident around forecasting, the overhead of administration, moving things, holding things, serving customers, interacting with suppliers, having to reach out to foreign suppliers. And then post-ownership are fairly straightforward. What do we do at the end of life? How do we dispose? Have we incurred any warranty costs? Is the end of life due to failure? Are we responsible for that failure? Are customers happy or not? And so some of the pitfalls we need to avoid in cost allocation. Firstly, with sunk costs, you ignore them. There's nothing you can do about them. Unitize fixed costs, that's fixed cost per unit. It might be a way to hide sunk costs. So if your suppliers are quoting fixed costs per unit, you need to interrogate those in case what they're doing is they're hiding sunk costs. Those are costs that are incurred by a supplier, for example, regardless of whether you buy from them or not. Allocated fixed costs, again, identify those things amongst the fixed costs that are avoidable, not the sunk costs. And what about the opportunity costs? What else could you do with the money? What other resources could you use? So a quick, swift run through TCO. We'll dig into it in a lot more detail in later courses, but really TCO is a way of embracing all the current and future actions that surround a purchased product or service. It should be TCO, not price, that's our central concern when evaluating the financial aspects of a purchase. That's what you're doing with your TSA. And you need to know how each supply channel competes so that you can align your sourcing decisions to whatever the strategic contribution is that's driving your procurement. In one supply channel, it may be cost. In another, it may be speed. Be very mindful of what those competitive criteria are.